Hello, my name is Sri Asare. I'm an executive board member in charge of curriculum development for the National Debate Coaches Association, as well as the director of forensics at North Broward Preparatory School in Florida. Today, I have the privilege of moderating a demonstration debate between four excellent collegiate competitors. On the affirmative is Gabe Chang-Deutsch and Holland Bald of Dartmouth College. Go Trees. Gabe will be the first affirmative speaker, and Holland will be the second affirmative speaker. On the negative is Clara Conry and Serena Rupp of Emory University. Go Eags. Clara will be the first negative speaker, and Serena will be the second negative speaker. The debate will feature the 2023-2024 high school policy debate resolution. Resolved, the United States federal government should substantially increase fiscal redistribution in the United States by adopting a federal jobs guarantee, expanding Social Security, and/or providing a basic income. This demonstration is geared towards beginners and will feature arguments in the NDCA Novice Packet. Specifically, the affirmative from Dartmouth will be forwarding a GND jobs guarantee case, which argues that the federal government should adopt a jobs guarantee modeled after the proposal in the Green New Deal. The negative from Emory will be pointing out the faults in that policy. The competitors will be using high school debate speech times, 8-minute constructives, 5-minute rebuttals, and 3-minute cross-examinations. When you're listening to each speech and cross-text, try your best to follow along by flowing or taking notes of the arguments made by each team. At the end of the debate, we advise that you take time to decide who won the debate and write up the reasoning for your decision. Without further ado, the first affirmative speaker from Dartmouth will present their case. Thank you.
Plan. The United States federal government should substantially increase fiscal redistribution in the United States by adopting a Green New Deal federal jobs guarantee. Advantage 1 is climate change. Climate change is on track for devastating effects. Action now is key, and every bit of mitigation matters. Chandraoskar 23. The most comprehensive assessment of climate change has been published by the IPCC. The impacts are already deadly. Policies in place would see 3.2 degrees centigrade by 2100. Humans and ecosystems will be unable to adapt. Losses will escalate with every increment of temperature rise. Governments can avoid the worst with the rest of this decade being crucial. We have the time to act. The U.S. has already increased climate efforts, but there's a lack of follow-through. Now is key to determine the direction of the energy market. Warland in 22. The next chapter will involve a tug of war between industry and policymakers gunning for preferred approaches to cut emissions. We don't know which will end up thriving. While the Inflation Reduction Act is a major step in the climate fight, there's a wide range of outcomes. A sustained period with cheap fossil fuels would hinder decarbonization. It could mean a continuation of hotly contested nuclear and fossil fuels, provided producers capture the carbon. A United States Green New Deal would coordinate the jobs guarantee with a broader transition to renewable energy and net zero emissions. Chetsky and Sirapuru 21. The Green New Deal centered on a government-led society-wide effort to dramatically reduce emissions and shift the economy to be less carbon intensive. Cutting net emissions to zero, spurring massive growth in clean manufacturing, meeting power demand through clean, renewable, zero-emission sources, upgrading infrastructure, guaranteeing a job with a family-sustaining wage. It should be a duty of the federal government and include public financing. A green job guarantee ensures labor for new green infrastructure. Galvin and Healy 20. Limiting temperature to 1.5 degrees centigrade will require net zero by 2050. This target necessitates rapid, far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban, and infrastructure. In the Green New Deal, achieve net zero emissions through a just transition and create millions for good jobs. The UK Labour Party, German Green Party, Spanish Socialist Party, and the European Commission have all proposed a GND. The GND ensures a smooth transition. Wages and training can be targeted for fossil fuel workers while also providing a broader safety net. Cherneva in 20. The jobs guarantee has been called the most crucial component of the Green New Deal. There are no purely technological fixes to climate catastrophe. Fixing the environment takes work. Many who want decent paid work cannot find it. Paid work must support environmental conservation. There are two different ways. The first aims to guarantee a job with a family-sustaining wage to all people of the United States. Some policy proposals guarantee job training and placement for fossil fuel workers. Transitioning now is key to both mitigation and adaptation. The GND avoids the worst impacts of climate change. Lochman in 23. The price of moving to a net zero emissions economy will be less than the cost of mitigating climate change. Coastal cities will disappear. Sea levels will rise. Conversion to green energy is much cheaper. Mitigation can at best save a fraction. Construction of green energy infrastructure will need to be undertaken by governments. Green Green energy will open opportunities for creating good jobs. Mitigation can help only if global warming is kept to a terrible rather than a catastrophic level. Climate change is an existential threat. Every bit of mitigation saves countless lives. Borenstein and 22. Deadly now, climate change is about to get much worse. Climate change is a threat to human and planetary health. Delaying cuts in emissions and waiting will miss a rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. 3.3 billion people's lives are highly vulnerable and 15 times more likely to die from extreme weather. More people are going to die from heat waves, diseases, extreme weather, pollution, and starvation. With every 10th of a degree of warming, many more people die. Risk can still be prevented or lessened with prompt action. Climate change will be catastrophic. Defense doesn't assume non-linear effects nor extreme risk. Kemp et al. 22. Toronto described climate change as second only to global nuclear war. Climate catastrophe is understudied. The potential depends on magnitude and rate damage inflicted on systems and vulnerability. The extremes of these areas are underexamined. Studies of how climate impacts cascade or trigger larger crises are sparse. Climate science err on the side of least drama. Do not be alarmist. It is mismatched to the risks posed by climate change. Temperature rise has fat tails, low probability, high impact, extreme outcomes. Damages are nonlinear. Advantage 2 is agriculture. Industrial agriculture is risking societal and ecological collapse. U.S. policy to promote sustainable small farming is needed. Sanderson and Cox 21. In the United States, industrial agriculture is rendering landscapes uninhabitable. The U.S. Corn Belt produces 75% of corn, but 35% of the region has lost its topsoil. Nutrient runoff has created a dead zone the size of Massachusetts. Ecological consequences manifest. We are peering into an abyss of systemic collapse because every effort has been made to use industrialization to break ecological limitations, rendering us vulnerable. This bill would promote a transition to smaller, more diverse farm operations. Diversification will work most on modest-sized farms. The Green New Deal solves both necessary labor and development of sustainable agriculture. Guelph 23. The Green New Deal will redirect research money from fossil fuels towards wind, solar, and geothermal, invest in sustainable, non-toxic materials, as well as organic agriculture, permaculture, and sustainable forestry. It will provide jobs in sustainable organic agriculture. This would a public jobs guarantee to secure decent paid work. The economic multiplier would generate another 414,000 jobs. The cost of the federal government would be relatively small because it corresponds with huge savings and unemployment insurance. The GND's retraining and jobs guarantee for sustainable agriculture are key to soil health and long-term U.S. farming. Fettleman et al. In 23. The agricultural land could be one of our greatest resources. Instead of an asset, our nation's soil bank is a major ecological liability. When we eliminate pesticides, the hydrologic function improves. The total annual cost of erosion in the U.S. is about $44 billion. The economics of farming are failing. Farmers' policies that improve soil health can improve environmental and economic equity. It focuses on policies that incentivize monoculture farms, lack of training and support for farmers who want healthy practices. Employment is key to redevelop farmland while maintaining crop yields. Sullivan and 23. Agroecological principles include reliance upon biodiversity to reproduce ecosystems. Agroecology entails shifts in scale, scope, and inputs. Yields would fall, but would be compensated by reallocation of land away from feed crops towards food crops. Agroecological methods can reduce fossil fuel inputs, enable organic agriculture, and maintain high yields. Sustainable agriculture is much more labor-intensive. Farming can be a substantial source of employment. Sustainable ag will be modeled globally. The U.S. will leverage multilateral ties. Goldstein and Oken, 21. Biden has encouraged the world with commitment to Paris, but this will not be achieved without comprehensive exercise of leadership to confront food security. The challenge will demand policy innovation. Failure to mitigate sustainability of food will devastate the multilateral effort. The United States historically used food policy to strengthen its relationship with allies. The United States is posed to use its history of innovation to enhance its influence. The United States should leverage public sources to accelerate transition to global food sustainability. Food insecurity drives global conflict over resources. Sova and Zembilicki, 23. Food insecurity can lead to instability. There is a vicious feedback loop between conflict and hunger. With Ukraine lingering economic impacts of COVID and extreme climate events, 2022 was a year of unprecedented global hunger. Global instability rose. In a review of 60 academic studies, food-related instability has 3 drivers: climate change, conflict over natural resources, and economic shocks. Food crises are likely to escalate to national security threats. Preventative measures are key. Sova and Zembilicki, 23. Insecurity is often the straw that breaks the camel's back, or a threat multiplier. Terrorist organizations employ recruitment tactics. Food price riots are a good example. Hunger emergencies must be addressed before they metastasize into large-scale security threats. Food insecurity is of consequence to national security. I stand open for cross-checks.
Are you ready?
Yep.
Okay. I want to talk about the climate advantage first. So China accounts for like 27% of global climate emissions. India is 7%. Other countries have a massive share. What does the GND do to avoid global tipping points?
Yeah, we've read a set of evidence that other countries are currently moving towards more sustainable economic modalities. The Borenstein evidence and the Chernova evidence both cite European and Asian emissions.
What evidence?
Yes.
What evidence it seems like Chinese and Indian emissions that are on the rise?
Well, we have not read a single card about Chinese or Indian emissions. If you read a card about this, we will read evidence in response. But we do think the United States controls the market for carbon technologies and is a global leader given its alliance network, relationships with other nations. So change in the United States response to climate change would be sufficient and necessary to reverse global tipping points.
Okay, what sort of climate mitigation measures does the GND include besides investment in sustainable tech?
That's the most important. So creating a sustainable power grid is the most important. Also funding like CCS jobs, I think would be part of that. But it's infrastructure.
That makes sense. The agriculture advantage. What's the time frame for food wars over ag output now?
There's not a single time frame. The Sova and Zembelecki evidence say that climate change exacerbates all conflicts because it means that there's more resource insecurity. So we think that a war resulting from food insecurity is likely, and that the escalatory pressures will cause that to become a national security threat.
But what is the time frame for that escalating? So is climate change the internal link to food conflicts happening?
No, we think that it's a driver, but we think that a transition to local sustainable agriculture creates more resiliency in the face of resource overshoot.
How soon could we see food conflicts that escalate absent the F?
Well, we've read evidence that currently there are food conflicts that could possibly escalate, but again, it's probabilistic. It's not time frame based. So our argument is that conflicts are more likely to escalate, not that they will occur at a specific moment in time.
So, but the plan solvency relies on like long-term retraining, innovations in new tech. How does the app prevent those short-term conflicts from escalating?
I guess we disagree about the meaning of long-term. The Goldstein and Oken evidence and Selwyn evidence indicate that the reallocation of labor power towards sustainable agriculture could occur relatively quickly. Yes, we would not solve anything that occurred in the next few years probably, but that's not key because things can become more and more deadly as climate change and other resource use pressures intensify.
I'm good.
It's going to be 3 off case and then the case.
In what order will the case be?
First advantage, second advantage, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. Okay, is everyone good now?
Yes.
The first off-case position is the nuclear power dissent. First, uniqueness. American nuclear power leadership and exports are increasing now. Bazillion and Gilbert 23. The factors creating headwinds for U.S. nuclear exports have shifted. Climate policy continues to grow in salience with nuclear energy emerging as key technology. Russian dominance of energy markets is a geopolitical flashpoint. Just international conditions have created an opening for renewed American competitiveness. Favorably, domestic policy has strengthened the sector to prevent retirements. Recently, energy bills boost existing and new reactors. Next, the link. The Green New Deal's renewables focus crowds out nuclear power. Penny and Calderon 20. The Green New Deals rely heavily on renewables to decarbonize the economy. The view of renewables harmonious and carbon neutral technology is romantic. Instability of their grid causes blackout. California could be a preview of the Green New Deal. Any climate plan that doesn't prioritize nuclear above all other sources is destined to exacerbate climate problems. The internal link. U.S. nuclear exports are key to prevent nuclear proliferation. Lovering and Morgan 21. Declining nuclear exports are eroding the ability of the U.S. to play a major role in maintaining safeguards against the diversion of nuclear materials. Exports come with safety, security, and non-proliferation strings. Russia and China are preparing to supply newcomer countries. U.S. commercial nuclear industry has played a significant role in U.S. leadership in international control regimes with diminishing civilian nuclear power. U.S. influence is likely to decline, particularly next-generation technologies. Finally, the impact of nuclear use may be a serious threat, and proliferation into a multipolar nuclear order may encourage this. Preventing the failure of deterrence may be more challenging. The nuclear cascade suggests if a state can defy the non-proliferation regime, other states are likely to follow. There are 30 states that have the ability to quickly build weapons. Proliferation to autocratic states is a cause for concern because they are less stable and more willing to utilize nuclear weapons. Threat of regime change is realistic. It could escalate into conflict as forces seek to secure assets and end up in conflict with each other. The next off case is the carbon tax counterplan. The United States federal government should establish a national carbon tax. Carbon taxation creates incentives to adopt green technology while using the existing grid and nuclear power. It solves comparatively better than the Green New Deal. Lynn 21. An alternative to the Green New Deal would separate infrastructure and energy. An economy dominated by solar and wind would require massive investments. If the goal of reducing emissions is promoted by replacing coal with zero carbon nuclear energy, the existing grid is adequate. To generate the same electricity as nuclear power renewables requires 450 times the land. A moderate carbon tax would create an incentive to phase out coal without discrimination against development of other sources. The next off case is the economy decide. First, uniqueness. The economy is growing sustainably now. CEIL 23. The U.S. faces challenges. Those are global. They include inflation, bank, labor, and geopolitical risks. We need to put things in perspective. America keeps chugging along. The reason is that growth is stronger than competitors. Our country remains the top economy in the world, fastest growing post-COVID. Don't bet against the U.S. Rebalancing may be positive for the economy, labor force participation, and wage growth. Support sustainability. Labor pool, finding higher wages, diversifying from China, minimizing risks. This is a net positive for the economy. Bonds will do well. Investors are given the opportunity to pick the highest yield that help mitigate risks. We will see strong returns. Perspective is needed. I don't anticipate soon inequity due to strong labor, Fed pause, and growth that dominates other economies. But political capture ensures the plan's job growth wrecks the private sector. That's critical to overall economic health. Smith 19. Politics turn a job guarantee less beneficial for the economy that would put pressure on the administrator. Result would be dropped in productive, increased resentment, and disruption of workplace guarantees. Jobs cannibalize the private sector and make the economy less productive. A job guarantee will compete with private entities, and guarantees would win that competition. They would call for steady, higher wages that would exceed private companies' ability to pay. The guarantee represents benchmark and make up a larger slice of the economy. This would reduce productivity. Short-term jobs tend not to find work in the private sector. Guaranteed jobs would be low productivity. The private sector would find itself deprived of people who make modern economy run. This would be a one-way ratchet to communism. Unchecked economic decline causes war. Studies prove. Libitude and Cavarelli 23. Based on the sample of 133 countries over a 30-year period, we find a significant relationship. A negative shock leads to an increase in conflict events and fatalities. The results are robust. A plausible variation results suggest a vicious cycle of worsening economic conditions and deteriorating conflicts. Negative shock increases incidence and intensity of conflicts, even in a statistically significant way. The climate advantage. 1. Labor shortages prevent solvency. Clean tech demand now prove there are not enough workers. Volvicki 23. U.S. clean energy companies are offering better wages. The firms try to overcome a labor shortage that threatens to derail Biden's climate agenda. With the U.S. employment rate at a historic low, companies fear they will struggle to fill these jobs, and plans to transition away from fossil fuels could stall out. A shortage is anticipated to hit especially hard in electric vehicles and solar panel installations. 2. The Green New Deal would not solve climate change. Deriska and Loris 19. Estimates significantly underestimate the cost of the Green New Deal. Policies are highly regressive. Higher energy costs affect a low-income household disproportionately. The Green New Deal's policies would be ineffective in abating temperature increases and reducing sea level rise. Even if the U.S. were to cut CO2 emissions 100%, it would have a negligible impact. 3. The Green New Deal isn't enough. International emitters like China, India, and the EU are alternative causes. Unilateral U.S. efforts can't fix a global crisis. 4. Turn. Federal planning of environmental projects ensures investments in failures. Winston 19. In 2009, a stimulus bill promised shovel-ready projects that would create jobs in green energy. What they got was 30 straight months of unemployment at 9%. 5. Climate change is locked in. Tandaliski and Lippert 22. After years of ignoring scientists, it's too late. Catastrophic impacts is already a different world. Scientists are more scared about the future than they admit in the public. Reluctance to acknowledge futility only makes things worse. Instead of focusing on net zero, which won't reverse current course, we need to adapt to the hothouse world. The ag advantage. 1. The Green New Deal fails to solve employment and ensures mass layoffs. Rindador 19. These policies backfired. Wage and price inflation made things worse for the working class Americans. The New Deal raised wages and made it more difficult to find work. The Green New Deal would crush poor Americans. Low-income Americans spend a higher than average percentage of their income on energy. Costs will only increase as fossil fuels are taxed. Minimum wage hikes increase unemployment, putting more pressure on the government to become an employer of the last resort. The Green New Deal is short-sighted in its regulatory approach. It would require a massive decline in productivity and result in mass layoffs. 2. Sustainable ag innovations are already coming now. Ku and Cerna 23. Ag tech is here to increase efficiency, productivity, and sustainability, such as precision agriculture, smart irrigation, biotechnology, and automation. Vertical farming can increase crop yields, overcome limited land area, and reduce farming's impact on the environment. This can control variables such as light, humidity, and water to precisely measure year-round, increasing food production. Labor is also greatly reduced. 3. Turn. Large farms are better than small farms for both yields and environmental measures. Nordhaus and Boston Radio 21. Food will need to be produced by large farms with little labor far away from the people who consume it. Shares vastly overestimate how food is produced organically. Organic farms don't outperform conventional farms by environmental measures. Scale, technology, and productivity make environmental and economic sense because organic farming requires more land. A large-scale shift to organic farming would entail a greater habitat loss, greenhouse gas emissions. Large-scale U.S. farms are so efficient economically and environmentally, they are also able to produce vastly more food, making the country's world's largest agricultural exporter. 4. Organic farming is worse for the environment and food security. Glassman 21. Organic farming is highly inefficient, producing 40% less food. Food prices are rapidly rising. The problem isn't the cost, but the damage to the climate. Organic farming issues the latest technology. Organic use in enormous quantities of pesticides, but they are natural origin. Just because something isn't natural doesn't make it non-toxic. Okay, I'm ready for cross-ex.
The carbon tax counterplan, what would the revenue of the carbon tax be used for?
I don't know, Serena, do we have like what the revenue would be used for? Our argument is just that it would solve and avoid the disad because it would allow us to include like continue developing like nuclear power.
The Lin 21 piece of evidence indicates that it would be able to resolve emissions. What is your solvency argument for advantage 2, which is about a transition away from industrial agriculture?
Our argument is that carbon taxation would allow the adoption of green technology that would include stuff for agriculture that makes it more green, i.e. a bunch of the things that were listed in some of the like year one.
What emissions would be taxed?
Carbon emissions.
Okay, so methane used on farms not taxed because methane is not carbon.
Sure.
Secondly, and then if a company that's incorporated in the United States invests in infrastructure abroad, would carbon that is from that infrastructure abroad be taxed?
I don't think so, because I don't think so.
And then the reverse, if a company is incorporated in another nation and invests in energy infrastructure in the United States, would carbon emissions from that company's infrastructure in the United States be taxed?
Sorry, say that again. I got lost in the middle of the question. If an international company is investing in a company in the US, would it be taxed? Is that the question?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. It would tax the company that's emitting the carbon. So whatever company that the company abroad is investing in, that company would be taxed.
Okay. The nuclear power disadvantage, the internal link. What nations are not proliferating because of U.S. nuclear exports?
Well, our argument is that it kind of creates a broad disincentive to proliferate because the U.S. can check nuclear exports, i.e. we would know if a country was proliferating because we could monitor nuclear exports, et cetera, stuff like that. So the
argument on the disadvantage is that when the U.S. exports nuclear material abroad, other nations would be disincentivized from proliferating.
There's two arguments for the internal link. One, that they would be disincentivized from proliferating, and the second one, which is that the US would have an early indicator of which countries are proliferating, which means we would probably be less likely to go into conflict with them because it's not a shock or like a bolt from the blue proliferation, which the US would be like super upset about.
Thank you. And then finally, the economy disadvantage. The piece of Smith evidence indicates that a jobs guarantee will reduce productivity measurements. Your internal link evidence, your uniqueness evidence is more so about employment broadly. Why is productivity key to the economy?
The uniqueness piece of evidence is broadly about the economy's health, i.e. that it's uniqueness for like the impact, but it's not a uniqueness piece of evidence for like whether productivity is high.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to take a little bit of preparation time for the 2AC. Okay, I took 30 seconds of prep, so we have 7 minutes and 30 seconds left. And I just sent the 2AC. While I'm waiting for everybody to get it, the order is the climate change advantage, the agriculture advantage, the carbon tax counterplan, the economy disadvantage, and then the nuclear power disadvantage. Okay. Is everybody good to go? If nobody verbally objects, I will start in like 5 seconds. On the climate change advantage, 1NC1 is about the labor shortage. 1, Green New Deal jobs guarantee solves. It ensures a livable wage and conditions for the renewables industry, so workers will come from fossil fuel industries voluntarily. 2, there are enough workers. Many Green New Deal workers are unemployed now, under season 23. The GND includes guaranteed jobs. Private employers can recruit from the pool. Jobs guarantee workers, most of whom are currently not employed by the private sector, can be engaged in many Green New Deal projects. 1NC2 is Green New Deal doesn't solve climate. 1, this evidence links to the counterplan, not the AF. It is about higher energy costs, i.e. a carbon tax, not a jobs guarantee. 2, the Green New Deal does solve. It facilitates massive investment in sustainable renewable energy. That's Lockman. 3, it is not too late, which is the main warrant in this card. Scientists agree that acting now can lessen the risks of climate change, and we can stave off fat tail worst case scenarios. That's Kemp, Borenstein, and Chandrasekhar. 1NC3 is the other country's alternative causality. 1, the US solves. We are one of the largest emitters in the world. We can also use our climate diplomacy, coaxing other countries to meet their Paris obligations after we've met ours. That's Goldstein. 2, it's try or die. Since climate change is a non-linear risk, reducing any emission could have massive payoffs in preventing catastrophe. 1NC4 is federal planning bad. 1, this evidence cites bad data. It is about one anecdote from 2009. Our evidence cites statistical data. 2, it is not a turn because it is not unique. The renewables industry is not growing now, which is our uniqueness argument for why climate change is happening. 3, federal planning is successful. Davidson and Silver 21. The vast majority of loans were winners. Loans to 10 utility-scale solar projects catalyzed the industry. Government programs helped launch renewables, demonstrating feasibility and lowering cost. 1NC5 is climate change inevitable. This was answered above. The next decade is crucial for determining climate futures. Some climate change is obviously inevitable, but there's a difference between catastrophic scenarios that prompt wars over food and water, energy crises, increased pandemic outbreaks, and refugee crisis versus scenarios where the earth gets a little hotter and there's more extreme weather. That's Kemp and Chandrasekhar. The agriculture advantage. 1NC1 is the Green New Deal fails. 1, wrong policy. This card is about the Green New Deal generically, but not specific to a jobs guarantee. The AF's guarantee would accommodate for layoffs by ensuring people laid off would be employed in renewables. That's GELF. 2, this card links to the counterplan. It is not about a jobs guarantee. It is about fossil fuels being, quote, heavily taxed, which proves that their counterplan links to the economy dissad by causing a bunch of layoffs. 1NC2 is sustainable agriculture happening now. 1, this card just says innovations are happening. The app is key to ensure that they get adopted at a wide scale. That's GELF and Feldman. 2, sustainable tech will not be adopted absent the plan. Milnuchik 21. Farmers face many barriers to adoption, including uncertainty, lack of expert assistance, lack of equipment, and high cost. Climate farming is not one size fits all. Government support is just beginning. Group 1NC3 and 4, they both say that big ag is good and small farms are bad. 1, sustainability. Big ag erodes topsoil and creates nutrient runoff that causes ecological dead zones. That ensures systemic collapse in the future, even if everything looks fine now. That's Sanderson. 2, the Green New Deal does not just cause small farms. It invests in sustainable technology for larger farms, and it eliminates problems like soil erosion. It also shifts land from feed to food crops, which ensures that we produce as much food even with smaller farms. That's Feldman and Selwyn. 3, smaller farms are better, both at ecological sustainability and crop yields. Ramagnudi 21. 79% of studies reported smaller farms have higher yields, higher crop richness, biodiversity increases because of ecological management practices, lower pesticide use, etc. Smaller farms have benefits for productivity and biodiversity. The carbon tax counterplan. 1, permutation do both. The AF and the counterplan are complementary strategies to resolve climate change. It is a non-linear risk, so the permutation is the best option. That's Borenstein. 2, the counterplan links to the economy disadvantage. A carbon tax would make private sector operations more expensive and be a macroeconomic shock. 3, it links to the nuclear power disadvantage. If it causes a shift to renewable energy, that trades off with nuclear per their link evidence. 4, it cannot facilitate a transition. A jobs guarantee ensures that we have the labor for building renewable energy. A carbon tax leaves it to the private sector to totally reorganize the economy themselves, which places too much faith in the invisible hand of the market. At best, it takes years, allowing climate change and big agriculture to worsen in the meantime. That's Chatsi, Galvin, and Cherneva. 5, can't solve climate change due to leakage. Toter 21. Carbon taxes are porous. Producers and consumers avoid the tax by importing foreign goods. Global emissions simply remain outside of the task. the tax. Even with benefits, carbon tax would not be sufficient. The only real solution is public support for development and deployment of new technologies. 6, the counterplan can't solve agriculture. Best studies say that it reduces agricultural output and causes leakage. OECD 21. Studies investigated effect of a carbon tax on ag production. Large carbon tax would result in a decline of ag production, while it increases production in the rest of the world, resulting in carbon leakage. Farms experienced a decline in profits even if exports were unaffected. BC carbon tax is directly related to higher production costs and overall decline in farm incomes. The economy disadvantage. 1, no uniqueness. The economy will collapse now. Hertzner 615. Deutsche Bank's top research team believes Washington has sparked a boom-bust cycle. The recession is the inevitable consequence of rate hikes. Indicator currently is handicapping the chances of a contraction near 100%. The US will see its economy shrink in 2024. 2, no link. Their link evidence is entirely speculative ranting from a blogger about a jobs guarantee without a factual basis. 3, link turn. The jobs guarantee stabilizes the economy. Prefer statistical analyses from PhDs. Huang 23. JG is a counter-cyclical automatic stabilizer to the macroeconomy. When the market slows down, the market will release more workers into the JG program. When the market expands, workers will be incentivized by higher wages by the private sector. JG complements the market. The fiscal deficit function to stabilize private sector balance sheets. 4, link turn. The AF creates 414,000 new jobs, ensuring higher consumer spending and economic activity. That's GELF. 5, no link. The GND jobs guarantee saves money on unemployment insurance, which is currently a big burden for the federal government. That's GELF. 6, internal link turn. Ensuring sustainable resource use is crucial for a sustainable economy. Otherwise, a hard landing is guaranteed when we run out of fossil fuels. That's Kemp and Borenstein. Agricultural erosion alone, for example, costs $44 billion a year. That's Feldman. 7, no impact uniqueness. COVID in 2008 proved that economic shocks matter less than fundamentals. Our turn outweighs because an unsustainable economy guarantees a larger scale collapse further in the future. 8, no impact. Economic decline does not cause war. Walt 20. Diversionary war strikes me as unlikely even if one ignores empirical flaws. War is a gamble. Supporters may wonder why he is wasting time. Military Keynesianism, I doubt it. It takes a really big war to generate stimulus. It's hard to imagine when debt levels are soaring. If depressions were a cause, there would be a lot more. The US suffered 40 recessions, 20 wars, most unrelated to the economy. Leaders will not go to war unless they think they can do so quickly, cheaply, with a reasonable chance of success. The nuclear power disadvantage. 1, no uniqueness. US nuclear will not return now. Economist 23. 3, massive difficulties dampen the mood. First, cost. Nuclear plants are extremely expensive. Second, where will they get fuel? Uranium needs to be processed. Russia dominates uranium processing and is the only commercial supplier. What to do about spent fuel? Even a temporary home could take up to 15 years to build. 2, no link. There is not a trade-off. If nuclear investment is increasing now, we can just invest in both renewables and nuclear energy because the Green New Deal does not prohibit nuclear investment. Their link evidence is speculative and does not make the claim in their tag if you actually read the highlighted parts of it. 3, no link. The Green New Deal permits nuclear power. Their evidence assumes an old version of the bill. Moitznitz 20. GND, a preliminary version of the bill, required phase out of nuclear, but the stipulation vanished. The GND leaves the door open for nuclear. 4, no internal link. The US has other ways to control proliferation, including using sanctions and diplomatic pressure like seen in the Iran deal. 5, no impact. Prolif is not destabilizing. Miller 21. Proliferation has been of little consequence. The few countries to which weapons have proliferated found them a waste of time, effort, and talent. They have not even found much benefit in rattling them. Stalin, Zedong neither used nuclear weapons. There has never been a compelling reason to use nuclear weapons, nor did the bomb benefit America in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan. Many argue the newly nuclear country will use its weapons to dominate the area. How that is to be carried out is never made clear. Those threatened will ally with others to stand up to the intimidation. I'm ready for cross-examination.
You good, Holland?
Yeah.
Okay, the first card on the nuclear power dissad. The first card on the nuclear power dissad doesn't say that it would invest in nuclear power. Does your version of the bill invest in nuclear power or only renewables? Like, where does the money go?
Our argument is that nuclear power is a form of renewables that the Green New Deal can invest in.
It says could invest in. Like, does the mandate of the plan put money into it, or?
Well, so the Green New Deal mandates a total renewable transition. It leaves the exact specifics of which renewables get invested in kind of up to whichever one the market picks. But your uniqueness argument is that investment in nuclear power is increasing now. So long as the Green New Deal doesn't ban it, we think that the nuclear industry would continue to grow.
The impact defense card you read makes some broad arguments about the difficulty of proliferation. Where does it say it's impossible to?
I don't think that it makes arguments about the difficulty of proliferation. It kind of spots that even when countries have proliferated, they have found it to be a waste of time, effort, and talent, and it hasn't been destabilizing because there's never been a reason to use them.
Okay, so your card, even if it says that it's generally like a waste of time, effort, and talent, where does it say that the countries that we've said like want to proliferate, i.e., that are facing dangers in different regions, don't want to? Like, what part of the card says that they perceive that this is true and don't want to proliferate?
We don't. So one, we think that it makes a historical claim that says that like if proliferation was so useful, more countries would have done it. But I think more importantly, this card is more of an on-point refutation to the idea that like even if these countries proliferated, this evidence says that would not destabilize these regions or lead to a war.
Does it assume one country proliferating or multiple?
I mean, Mueller is kind of a political scientist studying just general trends of proliferation. So it doesn't like name specific countries. I don't think your evidence does either, but it kind of says that in general, nuclear proliferation is not destabilizing.
Okay, sure. The first piece of card you read says that there's difficulties in nuclear power plants. Where does it say that like we're not investing in it now? We read uniqueness evidence that said that there's like multiple bills that have been passed.
Yeah, I would point you to the article title, which is America Aims for a Nuclear Power Renaissance. It kind of speaks to the momentum that your evidence is about and is like, we're gunning for a nuclear power renaissance, but this actually speaks to the feasibility and the obstacles to actually building those nuclear power plants. And
but
so
even if we're already investing in nuclear power, there's money going into building these plants, like why do these things matter? Like it says that it's expensive, but the federal government has already invested money.
Well, so I think one important thing is this concept of the home for spent fuel could take up to 15 years. But I also think that uranium needs to be processed, and it says that Russia dominates that. And we obviously aren't trading with Russia right now because of the war in Ukraine. So I think that that is a pretty significant impediment.
Okay, got it.
Okay, I'm gonna take a little bit of prep. I'll try it now. Okay, stop prep. We took 45 seconds and I'll put it in the chat. The 2NC is sent, just let me know when everyone has it. Here is the carbon tax counterplan, the climate advantage, and then the agriculture advantage. Okay. The counterplan sufficiently solves the AF while avoiding the nuclear power dissad. It establishes a national carbon tax which charges polluters a set price for each ton of greenhouse gas emissions they emit. That creates a financial incentive to phase out coal while promoting the use of existing sustainable energy sources like nuclear power. The 1NC Lind evidence says it solves better and faster than the plan by building upon the existing electricity grid. The first 2AC argument is perm do both. It fails. One is that while our combined advocacies may sell best in theory, it's a worse policy option than the counterplan alone. Including the AF triggers the link to the dissad by subsidizing a dramatic shift to renewables and away from nuclear energy. Second is that carbon taxation alone is empirically better. Price signals solve clean tech adoption, but the GND would waste money on failed projects. Washington Post 19. The Green New Deal reflects accelerating drift from the obvious. Carbon pricing is still the best first-line policy. If it costs more to pollute, there will be less pollution. Taxing would send a price signal to every business and consumer. Changes that reduce pollution become desirable. Market forces would steadily wring carbon dioxide out of the economy without the government trying to dictate how. An average carbon price would prevent the world from reaching the warming limit. Next, the absence of the counterplan links to the benefits. We're not extending the econ dissad, but the counterplan decisively doesn't link to nuclear power. First, the 2AC asserts that a carbon tax would cause a shift to renewables with zero evidence attached. The 1NC Lind evidence is explicit that, quote, a moderate carbon tax would create an incentive to phase out coal without discriminating against further development of nuclear power. Second, here's more decisive evidence. Carbon tax boosts nuclear power. That's Schnitzler and George 21. For the nation's existing nuclear fleet, a price on carbon would benefit nuclear resources in the market. Existing electricity markets value reliability provided by nuclear. Implementing approaches significantly reduces carbon emissions. Next, the 2AC argued that the counterplan does not solve the transition to sustainable energy. One is that it works faster than the AF. That's the Lind evidence. While the GNT would require a complete overhaul of the US's electricity grid, taxation would rapidly incentivize a shift to existing sustainable sources. While the GNT requires years of investment, development, and job training as per 1AC cross-ex, a carbon tax takes immediate effect, which solves the scope of the AF better. Second is leaving it up to the private sector works. It ensures a switch to clean energy, and revenue can be spent on retraining and resiliency. That's Patnell and Kennedy 21. Carbon pricing is the most direct and efficient way to achieve reductions. Command and control methods are not sufficient. It would reduce emissions to close to 40%, the most effective tool for climate mitigation. Next, the AF says that taxation can't solve climate change due to leakages. One is that their 2AC total evidence equally applies to their own solvency. It says, quote, the issue isn't only the leakages from the carbon tax itself, but the amount of global emissions that remain outside the range of the tax. It proves all of the international alt-cause arguments that we've made on the case, because without multilateral action on climate change, no single country can solve for the scope of the crisis to a level that is sufficient to solve their impacts. But Leakage's arguments are false. Applying taxation to extraction and production solves. Weisbach in Cordum 21. A combination of an extraction tax and a production tax addresses the core source of leakage. A tax on domestic extraction raises the global price of energy because it reduces supply. Combination is simple to implement and clearly legal. Lastly, the 2AC argued that the counterplan does not solve the ag advantage. Yes, it does, because taxation incentivizes farmers to switch. That's Shazensky in 22. Taxing every ton gives entities an incentive to switch. A carbon tax incentivizes farmers and ranchers to shift to production that eliminates use to improve efficiency. Moving on to the climate advantage. The affirmative cannot solve anything close to the scope of global climate change for their internal links. International emitters like China, India, and EU member states are driving the crisis now, and they have read zero evidence that says other countries are willing to follow on or that climate diplomacy works. Climate change is inevitable abroad, even with US reductions. China is ramping up their production. Chenberth in 23. The US alone is on track to cut emissions, but even if that slows warming, it's not going away. If we get to zero, the world doesn't cool down. China is going its own way. Coal plant, power plant permitting, construction, and project announcements accelerated dramatically. International commitment to limiting emissions is at a low ebb. The 2AC makes this try or die claim, but it's wrong. First is that the counterplan sufficiently solves for the AF's impact, so it's irrelevant in terms of weighing the dissad versus the case if we extend the counterplan. But second is that climate change has linear tipping points that we've already passed, which makes further efforts in net zero futile, which is our next defensive argument. Catastrophic impacts are locked in now, which means that you have to prioritize the short-term existential risk of the disadvantage. First is expert consensus. The 1NC Tangaloxics evidence says that scientists know now that it is too late to aim for net zero. We're not facing scenarios where, quote, the Earth just gets a little hotter as per the 2AC, but we are already in, quote, a different world, according to top climate scientists. Food and water crises are here to stay, as per 1AC Cross-X, which makes their tail end risks inevitable. Feedback loops like ice sheet melting have already been triggered, which locks in climate change. That's McGuire in 22. We pass one or more points of no return. Whatever we do in terms of slashing emissions, we can no longer avoid the iceberg. Even if temperatures stopped rising today, melting would continue to accelerate. Positive feedback loops heat up the planet even more. Quoted forecasts for future temperatures rise should be taken as minimum rather than max. Now, the affirmative ag advantage. No uniqueness for the advantage at all. Sustainable agriculture is inevitable now. Precision agriculture, smart irrigation, biotech, vertical farming, and automation are rapidly improving the efficiency and productivity of current crop yields, which is the Q and CERTA evidence from 2023. The AF is wrong that sustainable tech is not being adopted, and they only have 2021 evidence to substantiate it. The Q and CERTA evidence is from this year, and it says that strategies are being deployed now. The 2AC Malinchik evidence is from 2021, and it does not assume rapid industry development since then. Our evidence explicitly assumes all of its warrants as such. Strategies are decreasing the labor costs that it cites, and government support is a non-issue. New ag technology is already being adopted, and private capital is driving innovation. That's Q and CERTA in 23. Greenhouses are increasingly emerging that are large-scale, capital-infused, and urban-centered. Tech is becoming an indispensable part of every commercial farm. Precision ag found huge opportunity to grow. The emerging gen of farmers is attracted to faster, more flexible startups that systematically maximize yields. And modern farming is improving outcomes on every metric. That's Parberg in 21. Modern farming uses low-impact precision techniques that require less land, energy, and chemicals. New irrigation systems eliminate surface runoff. Engineered seeds allows farmers to protect with fewer chemical sprays. Lastly, I'm going to extend the turn as defense that we read in the 1NC. Big agriculture is not unsustainable, and the scale, technology, and productivity of big farms decrease habitat loss and produce vastly more food more efficiently than small farms, which is the 1NC Nordhaus evidence. Even if it's true that small farms are slightly better or more environmentally sustainable, the AF would make them worse by forcing them to shoulder the burden of the entirety of big ag now, which means that they just shift the deck chairs on the Titanic. I'll read another piece of evidence that the Green New Deal fails at preventing climate change because I have the extra time. Actually, no, I can't find it, so I'm good. I'm open for cross-ex.
Cool. I want to start on the carbon taxation counterplan. You have made a lot of arguments about why a carbon taxation or a carbon tax would incentivize a shift or a switch to kind of renewable, like clean infrastructure. I guess my question is like, our argument is that that infrastructure does not exist now. Who would build it in the world of the counterplan?
That's not necessarily our argument. The argument is that it facilitates a shift to existing forms of sustainable energy. So that looks like natural gas, which is net more sustainable than coal, or solutions like nuclear power that can be integrated in our current power grid, which means we don't have to rely on sustainable energy, which is also the shielding argument for the net benefit.
Okay, so like wind and solar are out of the question in the world of the counterplan?
Well, I think existing technology that could easily be shifted to by companies that don't want to pay the tax is incorporated, but that mostly, according to our evidence, the Lind evidence says it looks like nuclear power, natural gas, etc.
Right, okay. My follow-up question then is that your uniqueness argument on the disad is that the nuclear power industry is like growing but fragile. I guess how can a sort of fragile and small industry provide sufficient energy for like the entire US power grid?
The 1NC Lind evidence assumes that and says that there are sufficient energy sources now that we can shift to. And it's the most effective short-term solution because it can be integrated into the current grid. So if it's a question of like which can solve faster because it has the capacity, I'm pretty sure I'm going to bet on nuclear power over sustainable solutions that are nebulous and have not been built yet.
Well, right. I think my kind of question is, it is not a question of who can solve faster, because our argument is that climate change happens on like different timelines and that we need a sustainable solution that will solve, you know, like years and decades into the future. I guess what evidence have you read that says either natural gas or nuclear power will be sufficient for like green energy like decades from now?
Sure. So one, our argument is that you do need to win short-term solvency. So like that's a negative claim as well. But second is our evidence says that it allows for short-term like shift and decrease to net zero, but also it allows for us to like increase the capacity of other sustainable energy sources in the long term. But in the short term, like we have the best capacity with the existing sources that we've got.
Okay, well, so then in the long term, if we shift away from nuclear to other sustainable energy sources, why doesn't that link to your disadvantage?
It's not a shift away from nuclear, but rather incorporating other energy sources. We think that we've read evidence, the Lind evidence, as well as the 2NC evidence, which is the George evidence, that says that the benefits of nuclear resources are sort of complemented by the use of a carbon tax, which means that it wouldn't offset or like trade off.
Okay, I guess I think that like nuclear and other sources is our argument on the disadvantage, but that is the one in R. So I'm good. I don't have any more questions.
Does everyone have it? It's going to be the econ disad and then the nuclear power disad. The econ disad concede no link. We're kicking out of it. There's no cross applications. Nuclear power disad. Nuclear proliferation outweighs one global war. Bolt from the blue proliferation causes a massive shock to the international sphere. The threat of nuclear attack causes deterrence breakdown because new proliferators lack survivable arsenals. Draw and escalates to US-China war. That's brown. 2. Turns the climate advantage. Nuke power is far better than renewables for emission reduction. Philott and Miller 21. Advances in nuclear power have improved the emissions of nuclear power are 1 to 700th those of coal, 1/4 of solar power. Nuclear waste volume is 1/10,000th that of solar and 1/500th of wind. 3, turns the agricultural advantage. Renewables would trade off with farmland, unlike nuke power. Lu 23. Achieving net zero emissions could cost $3.5 trillion. Maximizing land use efficiency is critical to ensure a cleaner energy future does not come at the expense of food security. Expanding nuclear energy, one of the least land-intensive census, could be viable. American nuclear power development is increasing. The Ukraine conflict created an opening for U.S. nuclear power markets, and a trifecta of energy legislation has put nuclear power ahead of renewables. That's Bazillion and Gilbert. The U.S. is having a nuclear renaissance. New reactors and domestic support. Hockman and Hockman 22. Nuclear energy stands out as the most powerful technology at our disposal. Nuclear sources generate more solar, wind, and hydroelectric. There are reasons to be hopeful. Modular reactors have been heralded as cheaper and quicker. 2 new acts modernizing have been signed. Recent bipartisan law established a $6 billion credit program. Nuclear energy may be experiencing a renaissance. Groups point 2 and 3, the Green New Deal links. 1, the Green New Deal's massive investment in renewables crowds nuclear power out of the market. That's Penny and Calderon. 2, renewable trades off with nuclear power. They require drastically different infrastructure. Sovacool 20. The scale of nuclear attachments will associate negatively with renewables. The 2 options show mutual exclusion, and each creates path dependencies that crowds out the other. A grid structure for large-scale power production like nuclear power will make it more difficult to introduce small-scale power like renewables. Optimization around renewables would impede nuclear. The military connection displayed by nuclear power would but not renewables means that each will be favored on a contrasting political circumstances. 3, the Green New Deal focuses on renewables is at the cost of a nuclear power. Even if they don't mandate closures, it will halt development. The card assumes the New Deal. GELF 23. The Green New Deal seeks 100% renewable energy. The Green calls for the halt of new fossil fuel infrastructure. The Green also calls for the halt of low carbon, dirty energy, including nuclear power. Clean energy does not include nuclear power. Declining exports the U.S. nuclear monitoring capability. That eliminates checks on nuclear materials. It causes escalation by eliminating early warning on proliferating countries, prompting aggression towards proliferators. That's Lovering and Morgan. Nuclear exports are key to non-proliferation. Safeguards ensure nuclear capabilities are only civilian and prevent loose materials. Otto 23. ISN has worked to support a new flagship program in implementing standards for security, safety, and non-proliferation. ISN advanced efforts to expand nuclear cooperation. These efforts ensure programs for the use of nuclear energy. We extended programs to enforce export financial controls and screening measures to that better combat unfair foreign trade practices, safeguard chains, and counter exploitative economic activities. Yes, impact. Mueller doesn't assume the growing threat environment in East Asia and the Middle East, which pressures countries to proliferate. Yes, motives to seek nukes. Multiple countries want denial of access and deterrence capabilities. Symbala 20. Major states in Asia and the Middle East see nuclear weapons as potential drops. Nuclear weapons, they enable denial of access, permit states to deter others. Nuclear weapons permit states to maintain a deterrence against a major war. Without its arsenals, Russia would be more hesitant to assert its claim in former Soviet territory. Nuclear proliferation risk is increasing. There are multiple hotspots and adversarial nuclear exports change calculations. Economist 21. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan could produce weapons in 2 years, make East Asia a hotspot. Authoritarian leaders seem inclined toward the bomb, and their effort can make it easier. In Saudi Arabia, there is willingness to talk openly about proliferation. Saudi Arabia could rely on the growth of the autocratic marketplace. Prolif domino theory is correct, and spread ensures miscalculation that heightens the risk of war. Sirasoni and Brown 20. Nuclear posture and strategic decisions have a significant impact on nuclear acquisition. There is nothing automatic about the domino. If South Korea built a nuclear arsenal, others would follow. Japan, Taiwan, perhaps Vietnam, a Saudi bomb, an Iranian bomb, these arms races would blanket the globe with nuclear tripwires. Countries having nuclear weapons would increase the risk of the use. The mere fact no nation rationally takes steps does not guarantee a nuclear war cannot take place. The tendency towards irrationality and error in a world with doesn't have risk could go up exponentially. Be skeptical of defense. The same safeguards of the past won't apply to new proliferators. Symbala 20. Unstable command and control could be joined at the hip to nationalist or religious hostility. Rationality is a loaded and subjective term. Leaders in Asia have no political objectives that differ from the Cold War Soviets, not illogical in but less road tested against accidental, inadvertent, or deliberate escalation under the stress of political crisis.
I'm going to take some preparation time. We're at 7 minutes and 30 seconds. The 1AR doc has been sent. We have 4 minutes and 30 seconds, 3 minutes and 30 seconds remaining. The order of the speech will be the climate change advantage, the agriculture advantage, the carbon taxation counterplan, the nuclear power disadvantage. Awesome. Refuse the playground logic of the negative alternative causality arguments. Just because other international actors are doing a bad thing does not give the United States license to destroy the climate. We are one of the largest emitters in the world. We can also use climate diplomacy under the Green New Deal to coax other countries to meet their Paris obligations after we've set the moral example of meeting ours. That is the Goldstein evidence. The EU is already transitioning to use the Green New Deal, so the US can transition the entire Western world towards climate diplomacy. Tipping points have not yet passed. The Genova evidence cites scientific consensus that says the long-term existential impacts have not been reached. They have not read evidence that speaks to this terminal impact. Net zero is not key to our impacts. Even a different world is not existential if there are new adaptation methods and a hothouse Earth feedback loop is not reached. That is the Genova evidence. Their Trembith evidence says that warming will occur. Our evidence assumes this and says the degree of warming is not locked in, which makes it try or die to increase infrastructure transition. Climate change is nonlinear. The entirety of tipping points as a scientific argument relies on exponential change. That means unknown tipping points can come and lock in civilizational collapse, pandemics and resource shortages. So any risk of solving climate change is sufficient to vote affirmative. Advantage 2, I will concede the defensive argument that big agriculture is sustainable, that means it would not be affected by the Green New Deal because it does not break ecological boundaries. Their other defense does not implicate advantage one because our impact is about global sector emissions, not just agriculture. The counterplan, 2NC1 is incorrect, rejects sufficiency framing in the context of climate change impacts. Kemp indicates that tail end negative effects of climate change are unpredictable, so we must try to maximally reduce emissions. 2AC4, the counterplan cannot solve the green jobs transition. We need labor to build new renewable infrastructure, including nuclear, which only a jobs guarantee produces. This means the counterplan does not solve on the scale the counterplan only solves on the scale of decades, which intensifies climate and agricultural tipping points. That's Chotsky, Galvin, and Chernova. The affirmative is faster than the counterplan. There's massive government capacity to fund new jobs. The original New Deal proves this argument. All of the investment required from the private sector is slower because it is more decentralized, which slows down the rate of change. 2AC5, the counterplan cannot solve climate change because emissions will move to other countries and consumers can circumvent the tax by importing foreign goods. This reduces the public support for the green transition. 1NC Cross-X proves investment from the US companies into carbon-intensive infrastructure abroad would not be taxed. This makes leakage profitable and intensifies their alternative causality arguments on the case. We do not link to leakages. The US is the largest emitter, and the Green New Deal sets a model for global transition. Production and extraction taxes do not solve because they cannot apply internationally. Ishikawa and Cheng 21. Border adjustments may not be effective in decreasing global emissions. Higher tax rates decrease the incentive to invest. Carbon tax backfire, increase global emissions. Cross-border carbon leakage is greater with full BTAs than no BTAs. The disadvantage, the risk of an impact is only as high as the risk of the link argument. They need to win that we reduce nuclear exports enough to cause widespread multi-region proliferation if we link to their impact. 2AC1, non-unique. U.S. nuclear will not return now. Nuclear plants are extremely expensive, and Russia controls all of the uranium processing. Even a single nuclear plant takes 15 years to produce. That's the Economist evidence. Their Hochman evidence says that nuclear power is good, not that it is coming online now. It cites 2 bills from 2018, but does not say that those are able to scale up. Russian fuel is a huge alt cause. Gardner and 22. Only one company sells fuel. It's Russian. Without a reliable source of HALEU, developers won't receive orders for their plants, unlikely to get commercial supply to replace Russian uranium. Ukraine has changed the game. The nuclear industry is a flop. Rauch and 23. Industry is hobbled by costs, consistently flopped, broken its promises to deliver plants on budget and time, failed to put the rest the fear of accidents. All of this uniqueness argument proves that there is no impact because the nuclear industry is already declining. 2AC 2 through 3, no link. We create jobs for any non-carbon energy, which includes nuclear. If they are correct that it is the most effective, then we would fund it. There is no infrastructure link. You can create local infrastructure that operates in a distributed scale. If they are correct that the nuclear industry is so strong, increasing funding in jobs in any other area will not reduce nuclear market share. The affirmative requires decarbonizing the entire U.S. economy, which massively opens space for renewables without reducing nuclear market share. Their evidence cites a call from an activist organization for the Green New Deal. Our Menendez evidence cites the bill text using the 1AC and says the section of text that they are citing is no longer present, which proves you should prefer recency. Finally, 2AC5, no nuclear proliferation impact. Countries lack the means and the motive. They're scared of causing an arms race, and they don't have enough money to fund more weapons. That's the Mueller evidence. The past 50 years of proliferation prove Iran, Israel, South Africa, and Belarus all have nuclear weapons, but that has caused neither proliferation spirals, and many have actually denuclearized. Symbala does not speak to political motivations, which only our evidence turns to. Finally, go back to the top. Nuclear power fails to solve warming, so that it cannot turn the case. Neil and 21. Nuclear power will not help. Not enough uranium. Only very limited plans for new power anywhere. Tie up a great deal of money. Workers could be used far more efficiently. There are no private companies anywhere building nuclear power. It is not going to be more efficient. Delays, wind and solar can be built cheaply. I rest my case.
Take some prep. Give me a second to pull my timer. Okay, start prep. Okay. The order is just going to be the nuclear power dissent, and then the carbon tax counterplay, and the climate advantage. The dissent outweighs and turns the case. Timeframe should frame your ballot. Failure to prioritize short-term existential risks over a long-term, terminally inevitable impact is the same as shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic. Nuclear proliferation causes extinction because rapid transition away from nuclear energy tanks U.S. export leadership and cements unsafe acquisition, which breaks down global deterrent structures and triggers nuclear cascade. That's the Brown evidence. We're outcarding them 4-1 in terms of impact defense. All of the evidence from the 1NR says that it triggers East Asian conflict, U.S.-China war, and autocratic first use, and that there is means and motive now, which is the 1NR Symbala and Economist evidence. But independently, the dissent massively turns the case. Nuclear power is the most efficient energy replacement to stave off climate change, and you should think of it as a status quo counterplan. US nuclear power markets are growing now, which the app tanks. One is for short-term tipping points. Nuclear energy is compatible with the existing grid as opposed to the GND's entire overhaul, which is a Lind and George evidence from the counterplan. It's a double bind because it means that either the app impact is incredibly long-term and they said auto outweighs, or the GND fails at preventing short-term tail end risks. Second is the one in our Phila and Miller evidence says that nuclear power is the most efficient replacement because emissions are a fourth of solar and other green tech replacements. It means that it solves better in the long term. Now, uniqueness. Nuclear energy is high now. The app evidence is a snapshot, but it is not predictive of long-term trends. One is the one in our Huckman evidence. It's the US just passed 2 new acts to modernize existing nuclear facilities and establish a $6 billion credit program to continue their operations. All of our evidence, all of our authors cast developments as a nuclear renaissance sufficient to overcome short-term bumps in the road, which makes their arguments about Russia a non-issue. Second is that Ukraine is our uniqueness argument. The 1NC evidence says that it creates an opening in the market for the US to exploit in terms of leadership. The link debate. The link is absolutely massive. The app fiats an overhaul of the existing American powered grid, and it takes nuclear energy with it. The closest they get to having link defense that is descriptive of the app in this debate is the 2AC evidence that says DND could, quote, leave the door open for renewable development, but that is false. One is the Calderon evidence in the 1NC. It says that it causes a direct trade-off in the market because it crowds out the use of existing power sources like nuclear energy. Second is the Slovakian evidence from the 1NR is excellent. It says, quote, the scale of nuclear attachments will associate negatively with renewables. The two options show, quote, mutual exclusion, and each creates path dependencies that crowds out the others. There is no evidence in the 2AC nor the 1ER that rises to the threshold as saying that the two sources are mutually exclusive, which means that the scope of the link is massive. Third is all of their arguments about assertions to changes in the GND are incorrect. The GALF evidence from the 1NR is the most recent evidence in this debate from 2023 and says that GND aims for 100% renewable energy, which does not include sources like nuclear. It is most recent, which means that it frames your ballot. Lastly, is their impact defense claims are wrong. One is there is means and motive now. The Symbol evidence from the 1NR says the concerns of over-deterrence overcome political restraints that gave sites in the 1ER without evidence to substantiate. Second is that states are not proliferating now, which is our argument. Export controls are reigning in rogue acquisition, but the app upends them and makes it a free-for-all. The carbon tax counterplan, I'm not going for it. Perms are just a competition. I'll explicitly concede that companies will move abroad to avoid US regulations, which is terminal defense to the case because GND has no enforcement mechanism abroad. Now, the climate advantage. The F cannot win this debate on their try or die framing if we win a risk that we've already passed global tipping points. The most recent and qualified evidence is on our side. You should think back to 1AC Cross-X. China is responsible for 27% of global emissions. They are not slowing. India is at 7% of the global share, and EU member states are ramping up energy use. The 1AR ignores the Chunberth evidence that says that China is exclusively increasing permitting and facilities for coal, which proves that there's not sort of any action in terms of global flow-on. All of their assertions about American climate diplomacy are on evidence and wrong. The 2NC evidence says that while US emissions are falling, China is accelerating their coal projects and permitting. Absent global actions, minor long-term changes like the GND solve nothing, especially with near tipping points and active positive feedback loops, which is the McGuire evidence that is ignored by the 1ER. Now, lastly, is that you should have to prioritize short-term existential risks if there's a risk that we pass the tipping points. The 1NC Tengalka's evidence is that scientists across the board know that it's too late to aim for net zero or anything that will avoid their sort of long-term crises that they're talking about. They said, quote, we are already in a different world, according to all the top scientists, and things like food and water crises are underway, which is also substantiated in 1AC Cross-X. At best, all of these arguments about adaptation and inevitable tech development prove the proven intervening actors argument that you should prioritize the short-term impact of the dissent over the long-term impact of the case because we have less time to act in the face of this one. Lastly, the McGuire evidence, which I briefly extended above, says that tipping points are already underway, which takes out their whole non-linear risks framing. Positive feedback loops have been triggered, which cause the planet to heat up even more, even if we achieve net zero.
I'll take the remainder of our prep time. The order of my speech will be the climate change advantage and then the nuclear power disadvantage. Is everybody good to go? Awesome. Great. Climate change is the largest threat to all life on Earth. Survival of our ecosystems, clean air, and water are the basis of human survival. Their disadvantage asks you to make an insane calculus, accept a rapidly heating Earth, which portends a world of increasing instability, food scarcity, pandemic diseases, and conflict over resources, because preventing that future creates a small risk that maybe a couple of countries are more likely to obtain nuclear weapons. You should discount that short-term nuclear alarmism in face of the magnitude of climate change. Even if their scenario seems scary and real because it is short term, ours is guaranteed to undermine the very conditions of life in the longer term. The analogy that the 2NR uses is particularly ironic because they are shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic. The Titanic of the Earth is sinking and they are trying to stop a fight in the kitchen now. They are largely thinking wrong about climate change. It is not a one-off event that happens or does not happen. Instead, it is an accumulating threat to our ecosystems and social and political stability, which worsens with each tipping point that we pass, which answers both other countries and that climate change is locked in, which are their two core claims about the advantage. One is fat tails. Our most on-point evidence you should read is Camp and Chandrasekhar. They cite scientific studies to say, yes, there will be some climate impacts now, like extreme weather and instability, but if we take drastic action, we can reverse the so-called fat tails, where we pass thresholds like ice caps melting, species die off, and air pollution that substantially destabilize all life on Earth. To give one example of how this might play out of thousands of different examples and different scenarios, the 10th of a degree of warming could be the difference between an ice cap staying partially frozen versus partially melting and releasing a deadly pathogen that shuts down the world and is much more lethal than COVID. That means that net zero is not necessary. You should not accept an enormous planetary crisis because we might have some smaller ones inevitably. Even if some tipping points are triggered, we should not willfully trigger more when there is scientific consensus on our side that says that it is an existential threat to all life on Earth. Second, expert consensus. Our evidence cites the IPCC report, which is the gold standard. It is the leading international panel on climate change. It says that we have the opportunity to stave off the worst of climate change. Their evidence largely says we are doomed to live in a, quote, different world, but our evidence speaks to how those threats can become exponentially worse with each 10th of a degree. 3, the Green New Deal solves, which you can classify from the counterplan that the 2NR wholly ignores. It does not assume a Green New Deal jobs guarantee. It is a radical transition of the economy toward renewable energy sources over decades, overhauls the power grid, and invests trillions in clean energy and sustainable practices. Our plan would be some of the largest legislation the U.S. has seen in decades, modeled off of the original New Deal, which revolutionized social services. Their evidence assumes smaller short-term fixes, but the affirmative is transformative and can stave off the worst of climate change. Now, this proper other countries argument, one, is playground logic. The U.S. is the biggest emitter, and you should not permit us to do bad things to the Earth just because other countries are too. 2, it is answered above. We mitigate some of the risk, which is both existential and exponential, and that is sufficient. 3 is diplomacy. It has dropped the cross-application of the Goldstein evidence from the agriculture advantage from the 2EC, says that we are back with climate diplomacy and need to get other countries to the table on Paris and on the commitments like the Paris Agreement, and that the Biden administration is willing to do so, but that requires an aggressive pledge from us first. The Inflation Reduction Act was a good first step, but if we want China to decrease their emissions, which is the main 2NR warrant, we need aggressive action to show that we are serious about climate change and following through, which is the Chandrasekhar evidence. Now, the disadvantage. First, I'm going to answer this: nuclear power solves climate change. 1, you need to answer it because our argument is that there is not enough nuclear power now. Second, an entire overhaul of the economy is necessary, which was explained on the case. It's a non-linear risk, so you should not accept the band-aid solution of nuclear power. 3, our evidence says that nuclear power cannot supplant renewable energy. There is not enough uranium in a discharge die for renewables, which is one of our Neil that the 2NR drops. Now, the uniqueness debate. The nuclear power industry is tube. Now, 1, nuclear power plants are extremely hard to build. They are costly and the technology does not exist. Housing for old fuel takes 15 years to develop. Even if we throw a bunch of money at it, which is their argument about bills and increasing research and development, it does not make a nuclear comeback easier. That's The Economist. 2, Russia. They have a monopoly over processing uranium. Obviously, we are not pals right now. We are banned from trading with them because of sanctions for the war on Ukraine. The sole commercial supplier of enriched uranium, which you need for a nuclear power plant, is Russia. Is Russian and sanctioned from trading with the U.S. It is not a negative argument. We cannot supplant uranium enrichment because the supplanting uranium enrichment would take years at best. 3, our evidence is comparative. Their evidence is people getting excited about the next nuclear renaissance, which is the 2NR phrasing. Our evidence is speaking to why people should temper their enthusiasm. That's The Economist and Rauch evidence from 2023, which prices in the 2018 bills that are the main 2NR warrants. Now, drop to the impact defense. Proliferation is not destabilizing. The 2NR has very few sentences about it. Kicking the means and motive part of the defense. Mueller is the most comparative historical evidence about what happens after countries gain nuclear weapons. So even if they are right, there is means and motive. It will not cause a nuclear war. Their evidence uses fearful rhetoric, but does not explain how that happens. Our evidence as a historical analysis is that nuclear saber rattling has never happened or been useful because you cannot credibly threaten to use a nuclear weapon. And the 1AR cites historical examples like Israel, Iran, and South Africa gaining nuclear weapons and that not destabilizing the international order. The 2NR is just throwing out hotspots and hoping that you don't know your geopolitics, which is insufficient to explain a nuclear escalation scenario.
Great job, everyone. Thanks so much, Gabe, Holland, Clara, Serena, for this wonderful debate. If you've made it this far in this video, also good job. In the description below, you'll find a link to my flow or my notes from the debate, as well as each side's speech documents that include evidence read by each speaker. Before you exit the video, remember to write an RFD or reason for decision describing which team won the debate and why. We hope that this served as a resource for you to get a feel of what policy debate looks like. Each one of us is really excited to see you get your start in an activity we really love. Good luck and good debating. Thanks.